Hello and good evening. Trinity Tigers, welcome, welcome. We are in a Learning TUgether live webinar series as part of our lifelong learning initiative presented by our lovely Trinity U, Office of Alumni Relations. I'm Nicole Luciani, class of 2009. A little bit about me: after earning my BA in Neuroscience and Sociology from Trinity, I received an MA in Health and Human Services Administration with a focus on prevention science from the University of Oklahoma. In my current position with Care Consulting Group, I oversee programmatic evaluation and capacity building for clients in multiple states and tribes who are carrying out federal grants or even local grants to address substance use disorder and overdose. Trinity's Office of Alumni Relations invited me to moderate tonight's panel, and I was very excited about this opportunity to join two of Trinity's distinguished professors, Dr. Gerard Beaudoin, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Biology and also a graduate of Trinity's class of 1999. Dr. Casey Leong is assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. So we're really excited that they're here tonight as our panelists. The topic we're going to be discussing is a very important one, and I'm grateful Trinity is calling attention to it. The problems related to substance use are so widespread. They don't discriminate. There's a very strong chance, in fact, that someone you know has been impacted by substance misuse, substance use disorder, or overdose. In 2017, the US Department of Health and Human Services declared that the opioid crisis was a nationwide public health emergency. And today, we know that more than 100,000 people are dying of drug overdoses every year. Recent data from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, indicate that synthetic opioids are increasingly driving deaths that involve psychostimulants. So like methamphetamine and fentanyl are increasing the overdose rates as well. And I think it's important to point out before we get started, that substance use problems like opioid use disorder can really develop from a legitimate medical need, right? Resulting in a prescription from opioids, such as, to treat pain from surgery. We know that overprescribing of opioids, fueled by the pharmaceutical industry and their multi-pronged encouragement, was a significant contributor to today's drug epidemic. And any kind of substance use is a risk factor that elevates someone's chances that they might overdose, but especially with opioids and psychostimulants. So before we really dive in, I want to make sure that you're all comfy and ready for the discussion tonight. I want to encourage you, welcome you to use the chat box to share, any input you might have there or resources you're thinking of, but especially to use our Q&A box. If a question arises for you that you want to pose to our awesome panelists, we will pause periodically and make sure that those are addressed. So please feel free to type away in the Q&A box. Now, we have the distinct privilege of hearing from Dr. Beaudoin and Dr. Leong on how addiction manifests in the body, why substance use disorder is complex and multifaceted in nature, and how this sort of information might help us support things like harm reduction efforts, treatment for substance use disorder that works, and long-term recovery. So Gerard, thank you so much for joining us today to share your interdisciplinary view of the science behind addiction. Your research in the biology department at Trinity there focuses on the effects of cocaine, right?
That's correct.
Okay, great. And particularly about dopamine neurons, you bring a multitude of knowledge and information. Can you talk to us a little bit more about dopamine and its role in substance use?
Yeah, absolutely. So dopamine neurons are been nicknamed as sort of the reward center or the reward neurons of the brain. And so they got that name very early on because there was some early data that actually showed in early neuroscience, we knew nothing about what most of the brain regions did. And so as scientists, we essentially put in electrical probes and then hooked it up to a lever. So what rodents were trained was if they pressed a lever, they could electrically stimulate part of their brain. And we placed these electrodes all around in different places in the brain. And it turned out that when they could directly stimulate their dopamine neurons, not only would they very quickly realize that they were stimulating the dopamine neurons, but they would do that at the expense of everything else, right? So they would stop eating, they would stop sleeping, they would just sit there and stimulate the dopamine neurons. It was just that pleasurable. And so, drugs and substances that tap into this effect very readily. And so before we go over sort of what kinds of drugs that do this, I have a couple questions for the audience. The first one is, what do you think is the most widely used addictive substance? If you'd like to, you can put in your vote in the chat. There's some excellent answers coming in. Actually, the most widely used addictive substance is actually caffeine. And that's because caffeine in and of itself is also classified under substances that fall into the substance use disorder, as it can both lead to a disorder that actually can both lead to use despite negative consequences, and in addition can actually lead to withdrawal symptoms as well. I'm guilty of that. I've had enough coffee that actually, if I don't drink the next day, I have massive headaches. So actually, what do you think is the most addictive substance? Actually, this is like now a different kind of question. What do you think is the most addictive substance? And in this case, the question is more about what type of substance can go from casual use to now be considered like a substance use disorder and inducing a substance use disorder. A lot of people are putting methamphetamines. Actually, amphetamines definitely can induce substance use disorder, but actually the worst and the one that most readily converts from casual use to habitual use is actually nicotine, actually. And that's also a very widespread and commonly used addictive substance. And so one of the things that this sort of highlights, right, is that there are some substances that in fact are heavily used that we're all sort of aware about. And ultimately what we would really like to understand, though, is why is it that substance use disorder and these deaths that are occurring are actually heavily driven by the opioid field and use of opiates and synthetic opiates. So let me show you my slide. I'm going to teach you a little bit about the dopamine system. So shown here is a human brain cut in half, and the dopamine neurons are actually found down here. They're actually found in the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra pars compacta. This is a very old section of the brain. This is called the midbrain. These neurons actually send a variety of outputs of dopamine throughout the brain. So throughout the forebrain, both to the prefrontal cortex, as well as the striatum and the nucleus accumbens. And this connection here is very important for some of the effects that these drugs can induce. Let me stop the share. And so some of the drugs so we know that if you can electrically stimulate your dopamine neurons, the animals will actually self-stimulate that brain region ad nauseum. Why is it that some of these other drugs can now convert into the substance use disorder? And it's, in general, all of these drugs have paths through increasing the amount of dopamine. And so methamphetamine and cocaine prevent reuptake of dopamine. So once dopamine is released, it's then reuptaken by the neurons at the terminals. The dopamine transporter that does this is a specific protein is bound by cocaine and prevents that reuptake, whereas methamphetamine actually causes that transporter to actually run in reverse. So it actually now releases your dopamine in a case that when it wouldn't even be stimulated or releasing anyways. Nicotine also, it has a stimulatory role as well. It binds through acetylcholine receptors. So these are the same receptors we use to move our muscles. we also find that these acetylcholine receptors are specifically activated by nicotine, and they're found on dopamine neurons. So this nicotine binds to these acetylcholine receptors that then activates and depolarizes these neurons, now leading to more release of dopamine. Opioids, right? The last two I've talked about are stimulants. Opioids themselves are depressants, and yet they can be as addictive or nearly as addictive as nicotine. And the way opiates work are actually not directly on the dopamine neurons, but actually on the neurons that synapse onto those dopamine neurons. So dopamine neurons and their activity is regulated by synapses. These are connections between cells. They can be both activated, so it can actually have increased release of dopamine, or they can be inhibited by these connections with these other cells. And so that's actually the inhibition is actually where opiates have their greatest effects. They actually lead to a depression of inhibition. And so when you depress these neurons that normally are meant to inhibit the dopamine neuron, you now have a greater activation of the dopamine neurons and greater release of dopamine from these cells. Alcohol and also has a similar role, as does marijuana. Marijuana is not necessarily classified under substance use disorder because it doesn't have some of the hallmarks that are seen as by some of these other candidates. And then caffeine, actually also a very addictive substance. It has a role directly intracellularly, so actually inside the cell, leading to increases in the amount of calcium, which in and of itself can lead to stimulation and activation of dopamine neurons. And so all of these cells are releasing dopamine. And now the question is, like, other than, electrically stimulating your dopamine neuron directly, or, using one of these substances, like, what's the real purpose of these dopamine neurons? Like, why can't we just cut them out? We don't really need them. Not going to use them for anything else. The reason for that is because we actually, as part of one of our oldest parts of our brain, the dopamine neurons are absolutely critical to how we learn to carry out our daily functions of life. And so where they play a role is in classical, they originally were shown to play a role is in classical conditioning. So this is like Pavlovian cue reward conditioning. And this is sort of one of the simplest behaviors and types of learning paradigms. It's the idea that basically we start to make associations between cues and things that are happening in the natural environment to potentially achieving a goal or achieving a reward. And so in Pavlov's dogs, right, he showed this with basically the dogs through continual pairing would start to notice that the bell started to come up before the food reward was actually delivered. And so after a period of time, it turns out that if you rang the bell, the dog already started to think that, oh, I'm about to get food, right? And so now I'm about to eat. And so they actually would start to salivate in preparation for the fact they were just about to start to eat. This seems like very trivial, and like certainly this doesn't affect humans either, but this is exactly the same pattern that we use to learn how to achieve goals and achieve like what we would like to do. We basically know that if we follow a series of steps and follow a series of cues, we can ultimately reach our goals. Sometimes this is very simple goals, right? So you can imagine, like, if you were like walking on a street, if you always go by this one store, you can always get yourself, maybe a small cup of coffee or something like that for free. You would continue to go by that store, right? And then maybe it's only on certain days. And so you would realize, okay, this is the pattern within which I need to now approach this, so that way I can always, get that free cup of coffee, for instance, right? But importantly, where dopamine cells fit in this is they both are, their activity levels are encode something called reward prediction error. And the way the dopamine cell works is essentially says they start to signal to the rest of your brain when something really good happens or something really bad happens that was unexpected. And so initially, when Pavlov's dogs were learning this paradigm between bells and food being brought to them, the thing that was unexpected was the bell they didn't care about. They had no idea what the bell was for. But when the food would show up, they had no idea exactly when they were going to get their food. And yet that's when the dopamine cell now would fire heavily. Through learning, the dopamine cell actually stops firing to the food reward and actually now starts to fire to the bell reward. And so there's a blocking of that dopamine neuron firing with the bell that now starts to fire more with the food that now starts to fire more with the bell. And then if you now prevent, like, ring the bell, but then don't give them any food, you find that the dopamine cell actually finds that actually that's a bad thing that just happened. And so they actually decrease their firing rate because of that. Now,
Gerard, can I stop you right there for a second and ask a question related to this? So as you're talking about as you're talking about Pavlov's dogs and the salivating as they see the bell, right? And all these associations that are being made because of dopamine and its reinforcing effect, I can't help but think about like triggers that happen, right? So when somebody uses substances and become addicted, that paraphernalia associated with that use suddenly becomes a trigger. Can you talk a little bit about triggers in the environment and how that also drives addiction and greater cravings?
yeah, absolutely. So these associations that the dopamine cells like facilitate, basically, these are exactly the same kinds of cues that we think are playing a role in recurrence of use, right? So you may have heard this before as called as relapse, but we like to call it as recurrence of use. That even after a long period of abstinence, people may actually still now crave again once they start to see paraphernalia, for instance, or potentially go back to old stomping grounds, for instance, right, or going back to the same environment. And that's because these drugs, when they're given, they both induce the amount of dopamine. But remember, dopamine does two things. One, they sort of signal when something really good happens, but they also lay the groundwork for changing synapses and encoding the events that took place that allowed you to get to that reward, right? And essentially the thing that led to more dopamine release. And so in many cases, it's thought that these are very powerful memories, right? The places like where you either obtained a drug of use or a substance, or potentially actually took that substance. All of these memories are now going to be sort of permanently etched and remembered, and can potentially, at any point resurface and cause recurrence of use, actually, even decades later. That's
so dopamine really is such a reinforcer for learning.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And actually that leads to one of the first steps, right? So one of the sort of a knee-jerk thing, right, would be like, well, so why don't we just like block dopamine receptors, and then we just now won't have substance use disorder? And the problem with that is that a couple of things. One, you would have a condition called anhedonia, which would be basically you now find nothing pleasurable. But then another aspect of that is that we actually need this system to navigate the rest of our life, right? There's actually a lot of learning that is mitigated and induced by this system. And so simply, cutting the system out is that's certainly not going to work. And so we're going to have to go with more targeted approaches. So I think, this is probably a really good point now at which we should now sort of switch gears and talk about, oh yeah, actually, this is a great question. So someone's asking about the connection between the dopamine system and the hippocampus and learning memory system. And actually, that's what my friend KC is now going to talk about. Is going to be talking about, what are these brain regions that are now being affected by these drugs, and the synapses that are changing in these other brain regions that are important for substance use disorder.
Yeah, I appreciate all that information that you shared with us, Gerard. And first of all, thanks for inviting me to be here, and for all the attendees. Thank you for joining us. And I know it's a Thursday night. The fact that you gave up some of your time to join us is very meaningful. And yeah, I kind of wanted to build off of what Gerard had talked about, right? So we have this innate internal dopaminergic system, and I will get to that question here in a little bit regarding the hippocampus and dopamine. But I think it's a very important point that we have to really highlight, and that is that this reward system has a lot of advantages, right? Our dopaminergic reward system in the brain has kept us alive as a species, right, for for as long as we've been a species, I suppose, right? The ability for us to continue seeking for things that are naturally rewarding to us, right? Food, water, shelter, nurturing, all of those different reinforcers that are rewarding. Because they are rewarding as a species, we continue to seek those out. That is an advantageous thing for us. The issue that we're kind of facing now is that this reward system has now been maladapted, and now we form substance use disorders. It's the same thing. It's the same way of saying, a lot of people are afraid of spiders. We try to avoid spiders. When does that turn into arachnophobia? Right? At what point does the needle switch from a normal behavior, normal reward seeking, normal enjoyment of pleasure, to a substance use disorder, where now this reward seeking is getting out of hand? This use of this drive to look for reward is getting out of hand. There are a lot of definitions out there for substance use disorders. None of them, even at this point, after years and years of searching, have really kind of encapsulated all the different important components of substance use disorders. But there are a couple of things that these definitions generally highlight that I want to make sure we all are aware of. There's a foundational understanding of what substance use disorder encapsulates, right? So it is a chronic medical disease or disorder that involves a complex interactions of brain circuits, genetics, environment, and an individual's life experience as well, right? It often results in the engagement of behaviors that become compulsive, so drug use or seeking for these drugs, despite negative or harmful consequences. And that's a major hallmark of substance use disorder, right? The fact that individuals will continue to seek out these substances despite negative consequences, despite losing loved ones, despite losing their job or their job performance suffering, or their school performance suffering, despite the negative health outcomes that might be associated with their substance use, right? They continue to seek out these substances. That is usually a hallmark characteristic of reward seeking turned pathological. All right. And then finally, a major characteristic of substance use disorder is, as Gerard had mentioned earlier, the recurrence of substance use, even after periods of withdrawal. And we'll touch on this a little bit in terms of what's happening in the brain, but you can see there are a lot of different components to a substance use disorder. And it builds up slowly, like I mentioned before. It's a chronic disorder, a chronic disease. It doesn't just happen overnight, right? And it's really difficult or challenging to put yourself in the shoes of someone who faces a substance use disorder, because thankfully, I would hope many of us have not been severely, I guess, are not severe users of substance of abuse. All right. And so one thing I like to do in my classes is to kind of have everyone think about, and you don't have to say this out in the chat, this can just be a personal reflection here. Think about a substance that you may feel like you use more than you should. Or think about a behavior that you might engage in more than you think is healthy, right? So not all of us, may take opiates. Not all of us have experienced, let's say, stimulants like cocaine. But think about other things like social media use or shopping or gambling. Other types of behaviors that I'm not saying are, substance use disorders, but from a behavioral point of view, there is a significant amount of overlap. And think about all the different processes that occur that you go through when this happens. Think about how, let's just say it's social media, Facebook or Instagram, social media use, right? Think about how that started. All right. Initially downloading the app, using it initially, finding it a little bit of rewarding, that in itself is okay. That's not a substance use disorder, right? The initial drug use is fine. A drink here and there is fine. But eventually, right, you do this enough, or even if you're a little bit susceptible to it, after you engage in that behavior or use that substance, you start thinking about it. You start thinking about it when you're not engaged in that behavior. You start thinking about it when you aren't actively taking that substance, right? That's a craving. And now that's kind of like the beginnings of the path to a substance use disorder, the craving. The kind of persistent thinking about it, right? You're constantly preoccupied with when's the next time I can do this, right? If I just rush through my work really quickly, right, I could maybe engage in this behavior. I could maybe get this substance, right, really quickly. You know, who can I talk to? How can I manufacture a situation where I can obtain this substance, right? What if I invited all my friends out to the bar afterward, right? I can definitely get some alcohol then. Or if I just stop by the gas station on the way home, I pick up some cigarettes. With enough time, you start taking the substance more and more, you stop liking it as much, right? And this is where I think the substance use disorder really begins to become a substance use disorder, right? When you start taking this substance over and over again, it no longer is rewarding. Now you just need it. Now you just need it because it's ingrained in your habit. Now you just need it because you just need it to feel normal, right? And that I think is now where the risk lies, the negative outcomes lie with you know, this substance use. And then all the other things that come with it, right? The difficulty in stopping substance use. Let's say you've taken, let's see, all right, well, so let's say I've smoked for years. Let's say I've smoked nicotine, tobacco for years, and I've realized, you know, I've got some health consequences. I've decided I have to try and stop. Now there's all this difficulty because I've got these withdrawal symptoms that I have to deal with. I have, you know, the potential of when I'm not taking nicotine or actively on nicotine, I feel anxious, right? I've got sweats, I can't focus, I have trouble concentrating. It just makes it very, very challenging, right, to stop this drug use. And then even after all that time, if I finally kick that habit, anything like Gerard was saying can kind of trigger it. If I go back to the same context that I previously smoked in, I might start craving it again, right? Without going too deep into all of this, the neurocircuitry, I do kind of want to highlight though, the reason why this is so challenging, the reason why substance use disorder is such a challenging thing to grapple with is because it does incorporate so many different brain structures, and there are changes, and if you, hopefully you can see my screen here, there are significant changes in multiple different brain systems, in multiple brain structures after chronic drug use, sometimes even after acute drug use as well, right? We're talking about, and let's see if I can bring up this laser pointer here. We're talking about, for example, the major reward pathway here in the NAC. We're talking about brain structures that change to make us more sensitive to cues and contexts that remind us of the drug. We're talking about brain structures like the amygdala here in the CEA that makes us more sensitive to the emotional properties. Drugs just bring up far more positive emotions, or when we're in withdrawal, the negative emotions are much stronger. We're talking about a system-wide change across multiple brain systems, multiple brain structures that basically keep an individual persistently seeking for these drugs or for these substances of abuse. All right. I'm sorry, I haven't actually gotten to the question yet, even though I said I would. So for example, we had a question about the connection between dopamine and the hippocampus learning and memory, right? Because of dopamine's rewarding properties, it activates the hippocampus, or there's reciprocal projections between the hippocampus and the dopamine system, right? When you take a drug in a particular context for the first time, right? That one bar that you had, that drink that was so rewarding, right? Now that bar becomes a cue or a context, and that bar can now elicit a dopamine response, right? If you're in that bar, even if you don't touch alcohol at that time, that bar, being in the presence of that bar or that club is going to elicit a dopamine response. It's going to drive just enough of a dopamine response to make you crave that alcohol, right? And then because we're all so smart, right? Humans are incredibly smart. We can generalize because our hippocampuses are so brilliant. We don't just make a memory associated to that one bar. We can generalize to every bar, every nightclub. Hey, that one bar was pretty rewarding because I had that drink that one time. I'm in another bar now. I'm going to have a drink as well because it's a similar enough context, and that is driven by the interaction between dopamine and the hippocampus and the learning memory system. All right. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, can I jump in with a question? Okay, actually, I've got a couple, but you know what you're talking about right now, it almost sounds like when you develop a tolerance and you develop substance use disorder, it's the same sort of brain system that you're talking about, right? For survival. So is that fair to say that it becomes like a survival mechanism? Like you think about a substance as more important than, say, food or water, right? It's like your brain is saying, I need this to survive.
When we're developing a tolerance?
Yeah, when you're addicted, when you have a tolerance, when you've got dependence.
I'm not sure, and Gerard, feel free to chime in whenever you'd like as well, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's our brain thinking that we need it to survive, but it is our brain trying to keep our system in homeostasis, right? We have so much of this substance coming into our body. We're going to try and balance it out. So like we're going to change we're going to rewire the brain so that this substance will not be as impactful anymore. Again, because our nervous system is really homeostatic, right? And so the individual will say, I'm not feeling as much of a reward anymore after taking this drug for a while, so I'm going to take more, right? If I want the pain relief from an opiate, right, that tolerance that's building just leads to more pain, more opiate use, I'm sorry, right? And then you're just kind of pushing for more neural adaptations, more rewiring in this entire brain circuit.
There is another aspect of this, though, which is this aspect of self-medication too, right? So you can imagine, right, if aspects of your life are not going well, or you actually are clinically, right, actually have depression, dopamine neurons play a big role in that. So that actually already in and of itself leads to it's thought that depressed dopamine release actually can lead to depression itself. And so if you now discover, if I smoke cigarettes or I do cocaine, for instance, and now all of a sudden I feel a lot better because basically you sort of tricked your brain into feeling better because now you're releasing dopamine. That can be some of the reasons why both that can lead to recurrence of use, but also initial use to begin with as well, right? This idea of self-medication.
Yeah, coping. I believe that's the number one driving factor behind substance use disorder, right? Is to cope with some sort of negative emotion or experience.
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Gerard. So Casey, something else that you had said a little bit earlier when you were introducing a topic is that some individuals can be more susceptible to developing substance use disorder. And I was wondering like what those risk factors might be, right? What factors might inherently increase somebody's risk? And I think most of us know, there's a genetic predisposition that could exist. So then I'm wondering, well, what does that have to do with epigenetics if you have a genetic predisposition? So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and increased risk.
Absolutely. Yeah, your genetic makeup definitely puts you at, I'd hate to say risk. I'd hate anyone to feel like they are predisposed to developing a substance use disorder through no fault of their own. But there are genes that are implicated in the likelihood of developing a substance use disorder. For example, genes that make rewarding substances feel more rewarding, right, than others without those same genes. And this idea of epigenetics, which I think, actually, you know what? I can save the epigenetic component for Dr. Beaudoin or for Gerard. I think he is in a much better position to talk about that. But I will talk about some of these other factors that definitely have been shown to contribute to the development of substance use disorder. You kind of touched on that already with, a lot of the times people start substance use when they're coping with the stressful situation. I definitely, when I was a little younger, I smoked to deal with grad school, right? The stress of grad school and the amount of cigarettes I smoked during that week my dissertation was due when I had to defend. I mean, probably broke a record somewhere, like just the amount of cigarettes I smoked that week. I've since stopped because, again, for all the reasons that we're going to talk about. But stress is a major contributing factor to the development of substance use disorder. Not necessarily the fact that stress produces it. I think that stress drives the use of these substances mostly to diminish the effects of stress. And once those substances are working its way through your nervous system, that's when you run that risk, right? Loneliness and social isolation is a major factor, right? That drives substance use as well. We'll talk more about that later on when we talk about how to maybe combat substance use, but loneliness has been found time and time again to be a major contributing factor. Childhood environment, childhood trauma, yeah, that also is a risk for developing a subsequent substance use disorder. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Gerard, I'm wondering what your thoughts are from the epigenetic perspective. So in my opinion, it's like if a youth might have genetic implicators, I could say that, and they're exposed at an earlier age because of their surrounding environment to something like alcohol, are they then do they then have a greater likelihood to develop, a problem with alcohol use? Or a similar example, what do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely true, right? So the effects of these drugs, the effects of these substances are very different to someone who is not finished development, right? And so, and that is definitely a major risk factor. I remember there was an old study that actually says they looked sort of longitudinally and found that there was a line around age 18. So if you start smoking cigarettes before 18, you have a huge likelihood that you'll be addicted to cigarettes for decades. Whereas if you decide to wait till after 18 to start smoking cigarettes, you're much less prone to transition to sort of substance use disorder with cigarettes. And so but there could definitely be long-lasting effects of early exposure to some of these drugs that then change how addictive or not some of these substances will be at later in life. Actually, that's definitely been shown in many cases. Okay, so do you have anything to add about that?
No, I think that's all you said is valid. I think something has to be said about understanding that your environment certainly can contribute to any disorder based on how it impacts gene translation, gene transcription. Even if, yeah, I guess maybe that's something to be hopeful about, right? Like, despite the fact that someone might be genetically predisposed to anything, right? There is still some element of control that an individual has over their environment, over their context, to try and diminish the effect that epigenetics may have, right, on their development of potentially any potential substance use disorder.
I mean, I will say these are very powerful substances, and so there are some risk factors that are genetically known, but it's not as if we could, do 23andMe and say, okay, this is someone who should never smoke or never do cocaine, because this is the person that will definitely get substance use disorder, right? Just to be clear, it's not like everyone who does cocaine or everyone who does heroin will get substance use disorder, right? The conversion rate is 30% or so for opiates, which is very high, right? So that's 1 in 3 people could potentially get substance use disorder. For cocaine, it's much lower. It's more like in the sort of 15% range, and alcohol's in the 10% range. And so, and exactly how this is going to be affected, let's not forget about the fact that environment and stress and these other aspects are going to play a big role in all of this. So, yeah.
So something that I find really interesting, have you two heard about deaths of despair and that phenomena? It actually comes out of economic research field. There's a study published, I want to say in 2016, 2017, from 2 economic researchers. And what they discovered was in areas of the country, in the US, where economic turmoil was happening, such as the shutting down of mines or plants or something that contributed, particularly in a rural environment, to their workforce. And, they had, the communities experienced a lot of economic strife. In those areas, they saw greater rates of deaths from substance use and overdose, right? So it's this death of despair. And the belief, when they were digging into this more and more, and this phenomenon has been studied a little bit more recently in just the past couple of years, it has this term deaths of despair because of that hopelessness element, right? Loneliness, hopelessness tied to tobacco use, suicides much higher, right? Alcohol use disorder, deaths related to those, and of course, deaths of despair very much contributed to the opioid epidemic. So I'm wondering about, environmental context, not just your immediate surroundings as in like your home life or going to a bar, but like the community in which you're living your life, where you're going to work, if you even have a job, your social relationships. How might those activate certain epigenetic on-off switches that drive that seeking out for using substances or recurring use?
Casey, do you want to start, or you want me to start? It's up to you.
I mean, I recently was going through this rabbit hole of kind of along that vein of despair and resilience, right? Just kind of uncovering all of this of what's happening from a neuroscientific point of view, and found that it does link to a lot of different disorders, including substance use disorder. And I think that one major thing that was highlighted was during periods of chronic stress, unexpected stress, or despairing situations, there are significant changes to the amount of neurotrophic factors that our brain produces. And these neurotrophic factors are, to put it simply, they're required for the general health and connections of our neurons, right? And the growth of our neurons as well. And those seem to be disrupted in situations of despair, right? And we know that those neurons and those connections, or these neurotrophic factors, are necessary for the healthy functioning of our nervous system, particularly in places like the hippocampus, particularly in places like, which is important for learning and memory, our limbic system, which includes emotional processing, and I think Gerard can also highlight this, our reward system, right? And so we're talking about an environmental factor that can essentially disrupt the production through epigenetic mechanisms of these neurotrophic factors that can have these long-lasting influences on the way that substances or substance use disorder can develop.
Yeah, definitely. There's been some studies in rats, I think, that have shown that there may even be some generational effects of some of these substance use disorders. And that's where sort of epigenetics maybe plays a role. There's been some studies where in certain rats, if the mother was taking cocaine, regularly, it was then found that then the next generation of rats also had different usage amount than if it had come from a mother that had like never used cocaine, for instance. And there's no real way this would be directly affecting the genes themselves, like the DNA sequences. So epigenetics is the control of gene expression that's not directly related to DNA, but rather the hallmarks, and there's markers on proteins that associate with the DNA that essentially up or down regulate the amount of expression that you get of certain genes. And so it's relatively new, like relatively recently, that we're understanding the implications of this, and exactly how this is done generation to generation is still not entirely clear. So.
Well, we see that play out in the field. We know that people who are born into families with a history of substance use disorder are at greater risk for substance use disorder, and that could be multiple pathways that are at play there.
Yep.
And then also, in thinking about it from a more positive side of like the treatment side, right? Mm-hmm. When a parent or a caregiver, they have children in the home or other people in their home, when that parent with a substance use disorder receives treatment and enters long-term recovery, that act itself prevents substance use risk among the youth and other family members. So treating one individual who has mental illness or substance use disorder, whatever, can have indirect treatment effects on others, or prevention effects rather. So you're seeing exactly what you're talking about, Gerard, in the field too. Yeah. We've got a question here in the chat box asking, is the silencing of genes related to addiction a viable treatment?
That's exactly what researchers in the field are now working on, right? Is what I would say this is currently being done in rodent models, right? So both rats and mice. How that then would get translated into actual human therapy, I think is a really big question mark, right? So in many cases, these gene regulations of gene expression are done using viruses that are injected into brains, and I'm not sure a lot of people would be like, yeah, sure, drill a hole in my head and inject a virus in there, right? So that's how you translate changes in gene expression that maybe work in sort of like a rodent model. Will that actually work in like a human model? I think time will tell.
Yeah, who's going to be the first volunteer there?
Yeah, I don't know.
This is a great segue into talking about, what are the options for substance use disorder treatment? So Gerard and Casey, can you both share your thoughts on treating substance use disorder, maybe from an individual lens, right? Like at an individual level, and then any roles that social supports might have.
I don't remember who's first.
You want to take it away?
Sure. All right. So I think, and then on the individual perspective, right, there's a couple different treatment options, right? There's both, there's the options of using psychology, right? So working with either dialectical behavior therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy are actually some of the best approaches. We do also have medications that have been developed that allow for treating some of these. And so it's some of the things, like, for instance, you may have heard of like the nicotine patch, right? So this is now essentially still giving you your drug, right? You're still getting nicotine, but now you're absorbing it through your skin. And the reason for that working so well, and it's now been approved, is because it's the rate of administration, right? The rate of activation of these receptors and rate of activation of the dopamine cells that actually dictates how addictive the substance is. So it's very slow absorption through and long-term through your skin. Whereas if you breathe it, basically your lungs are basically, just little tiny air sacs that are just designed to soak up oxygen as fast as possible. And so if you can, put nicotine into the air, or were to smoke heroin, for instance, then you very readily now can absorb this drug and activate your cells. And so slowing the rate of absorption by using a patch, for instance, for nicotine works very well for this. It takes a long time. You have to sort of taper, but eventually, you get to a point where you no longer need the drug. But that's not always the case for all substances. Casey, do you want to talk about opiates? Or jumping, keep going.
Yeah, I can definitely chime in. I mean, I think we have a question that kind of segues into that. Yeah. Right. So the reasonable treatment of opioid addiction with other agonists. And I think that is, I think there's a stigma to it, which can't be avoided. I think we should work on that too, right, from a societal level. The idea that, and I can already hear like my mom, like, why would you want to treat addiction with more drugs? Like, that makes no sense, or something, like someone outside just kind of giving that input. And yes, I completely understand that, right? We are trying to treat substance use disorder. Why would we just replace one substance with another? But there is merit to this, because as kind of Gerard was saying, and based on what the research has shown us, we can take advantage of the pharmacology of different substances, right? Like Gerard's example with nicotine. If you breathe in nicotine through cigarette smoke, that is a very, very different pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic profile compared to if you use the nicotine patch. Same thing with a drug like Suboxone or naltrexone or methadone, right? We have a drug that is designed to act as a partial agonist on the same receptor that, let's say, heroin or morphine or fentanyl might act on, but it doesn't activate it to the same degree. It takes a much longer time for it to get through the various membranes and lipid layers, right? The blood-brain barrier. It takes a long time to get to the body. It's not released all at once. It's a more controlled way of receiving that same reward, that same feeling, or a limited feeling of reward that may not induce the same widespread changes as a very large rewarding feeling that you may get from, let's say, an acute exposure to fentanyl, right? And so I think that that is something that we really should explore. But I also understand that there is a little bit of apprehension from the public in proceeding with this kind of research and avenue of exploration.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. I just add to that, you know, from the field in practice, medication-assisted treatment, that's kind of the term that we use, right? Especially in thinking about treating opioid use disorder. Sometimes you see it in alcohol use disorder. It's less effective than an opioid use disorder, but it is one of the most game-changing approaches that we've seen in treatment for long-term recovery. In fact, the field is starting to use the term medication-assisted recovery, because what it allows a person to do is to take medication just like they would to control their blood pressure, their diabetes, or whatever, and contribute to society again, get back to their regular lives, live a healthy life in a long-term way. So medication-assisted treatment is something that we're seeing more and more. There's a lot of federal funding coming out for it and a lot of support in the field. So really appreciate that question. Thank you. We've got a couple other questions that are appearing in the chat box here. First, a comment that says, if one suffers from chronic depression and takes antidepressants, does one develop an addiction? So let's go there first.
To the antidepressant, I guess is the question, right?
It's a really good question. I like it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm going to talk about it from a neuroscience perspective. So many of the antidepressants that are out there are known to have what's called a treatment lag, right? So when you take the antidepressant, it's not like Tylenol, right? You're like, you have a fever, I'm going to take Tylenol, within 3 hours, I'm going to have like no fever anymore, right? Many of these antidepressants, partly because we don't know how they work, you take the antidepressant and it's not until 2 weeks of administration that you actually start to see some of the effects from some of these antidepressants. And so, and on the side of that, right, is so yes, now you don't feel depressed and you stop taking it, you'll very quickly, go back to potentially the same, brain state you were at that initially, precipitated this. And so I wouldn't say that's an addiction. I'd say this was, an ongoing treatment to a system that, has gone out of balance, right? And that basically it's now helping sort of maintain, like, rebalance itself in that case, is what is the way I would say it. I don't know if Casey has a different approach, different perspective on that.
No, I'm on this. I have the same point of view here. It is I won't say impossible. Not that I don't want to say anything's impossible without fully covering the entirety of the literature, but it is very unlikely that someone taking an antidepressant for depression would be able to form what is classically defined as an addiction or substance use disorder. From all the classifications and characteristics that we talked about, but I can see why that. I think it's a valid question though, because you can certainly develop a substance use disorder or barbiturate, right? Barbiturate substance use disorder definitely does exist, and that's almost the same vein, right? Anti-anxiety medications or depressants, right? Or sleep aids, right? Sometimes that can also create, behavioral characteristics of substance use disorders. But for all the points that Gerard had already mentioned, I think it's unlikely in terms of antidepressants.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got another one here. Are there approaches to treating substance use disorders via drug delivery that are not psychoactive? To this end, is down or upregulating genes involved in the dopaminergic system inherently psychoactive?
I would say not necessarily. Up or down regulating genes doesn't necessarily in and of itself have to be psychoactive. And it's also, some of these other ones like naltrexone, which is actually doesn't have any habit formation. That's actually a direct antagonist of these opiate receptors. It's not commonly given, but it is definitely a viable approach for treatment.
Thank you. And then we have another question here from Lisa. Why is there hesitancy among the public? And Lisa, I'm assuming that you're talking about medication-assisted treatment where you are treating substance use disorder, yes, okay, with another drug. I'd like to just chime in for a second that Nora Volko, she's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA. She just released a statement today that talked about, complete non-use, right? So complete sobriety, for instance, is not necessarily always the goal, but this stems like in our minds when we're thinking about somebody who has an addiction, substance use disorder, that the answer is no use whatsoever, right? And that there's a stigma to that. You can't handle using any form of substance, and so why would treating with a substance make sense? And there are recovery groups who reject medication-assisted treatment. They have that same perception that Casey shared, right? Of like, you can't do any drugs, right? You can't use a drug to treat your existing habit. You're just replacing one habit forming behavior with another. And there's more and more research that's showing humans are far more complex and dynamic than that. And the stigma is what gets in the way, right? So there's just this ongoing public stigma that we have to fight against. And I want to commend everybody who's here today. Just by showing up and listening in, you are a part of these stigma reducing efforts that are so important, just by learning about this, right? And being able to talk about it. So big thanks. Casey, did you want to share anything on that?
No, you definitely covered all the important points here. Yeah, that's the reason why the hesitancy exists, and it's something we have to overcome.
Casey, you have a great question for you in the anonymous attendee.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, you should take a look at that.
Yes, actually, a lot of the work that I've been engaged in over the last decade or so, almost now, has been examining how to treat addictive behaviors in rats, but also in humans on the side with a neurohormone or neuropeptide oxytocin. So oxytocin, if you're unfamiliar, it's classified or it's termed the love hormone. It's released during periods of social interaction, during maternal or paternal bonding, right, child bonding, or a lot of meaningful social engagement actually results in the release of oxytocin, this hormone in your brain. And we found a lot of studies coming from our research and other programs that have shown that this neuropeptide can reduce seeking for various drugs of abuse, can reduce the rewarding properties of these drugs of abuse or substances of abuse, not just substances of abuse, but even for things like sugar and high fatty foods as well. So it's been extremely encouraging. And so kind of going off, I think a previous question, I think it may have been David who had asked this, treating pharmacological treatment with a non-psychoactive drug, I think this is one avenue to explore as well. Oxytocin is already available. It's commercially available. We give it to mothers who are to induce labor, right? It's out there on the market.
Thank you. And thank you, Gerard, for answering a previous question in the chat box too. I thought that was a very important point to make.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. The other thing I think we wanted to just touch on was the social support aspect of this. I don't know if maybe you were going to ask that. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so social support pieces. I mean, some of it has been brought up inherently with what Casey was discussing earlier too. Do either of you want to contribute and speak to what that means in our communities, in our societies, how we can encourage people to get into treatment, stay in recovery?
Yeah, I think that one of the issues, right, is that sometimes people have this impression that there's somehow weakness for having developed substance use disorder, right? And so I think that's part of the stigma that develops from this. But one thing I was really interested about was I saw this one study that actually showed a rat that was fully addicted to cocaine, right? They could self-administer their own cocaine to them by pressing a lever. And when the rat was given, they redesigned the cages such that the rat could now make a choice between pressing the lever for more cocaine or potentially going and hanging out with another rat. Not like male female rat or something like that. It was just like a buddy rat or whatever. And actually, the rat stopped self-administering cocaine and went to go, in fact, hang out with a buddy rat. And I think that this is where society can make a big difference, right? So I think a powerful support network where people are understanding can make a big difference in, potentially helping someone deal with their substance use disorder.
That's great.
I think if you go to any recovery facility's website, one of the major things they advocate for is a strong social support network. And there's a reason for that, as Gerard had already mentioned, right? There is something that is incredibly beneficial about having a social support system, whether it's family or friends or other people who are also recovering that you can act, or that you are accountable to, or they're accountable to you. And all of that could be working through, like the oxytocin system, like I was saying, right? You're just stimulating that oxytocin release in the brain. I mean, that's probably an oversimplification, but there are probably real tangible reasons why social support is so important for the recovery process.
Yeah, I mean, that ties back to the points that were made earlier about isolation, right? And I mean, we haven't really touched on this yet, but just how closely substance use is related and kind of co-occurring oftentimes with mental health disorders, right? Anxiety, depression, and others. We've got a couple more questions in the chat box. I know we are, I think, out of time. So I am going to just, for folks who are deciding to share even more of their time with us tonight, I'm going to go ahead and ask the question. For those of you who do need to hop off, we want to extend our great appreciation for you to be here tonight. Very, very much appreciated. Feel free to type any other questions that you might have. And Casey and Gerard, is that okay with you guys if we stick around to get those answered in the chat box or the Q&A?
Yeah, of course. I don't mind.
Great. Okay, so Desiree asks, I've heard that for those using opioids for treating legitimate pain do not become addicted. Is this actually true or merely a myth? How does the stigma of substance use disorder for opiates affect the treatment of pain? That's a great question. I can chime in for a second in terms of the treatment of pain, if you'd like, and then if you want to talk about the actual addiction part. We do know that since more and more research is coming out around opioids not being as effective for pain management and long-term pain treatment, as that has come out, there are a number of medical bodies and institutions. I apologize if you guys can hear my dogs, but there are a number of medical bodies and institutions who have revised their prescribing guidelines and their prescribing practices. And we're seeing this at the state level too. I was fortunate to work with the state of Oklahoma to help develop some new prescribing guidelines that they were giving out to all of their state funded providers. We know that for lower back pain, for instance, opioids aren't effective. And in fact, taking opioids for a longer period of time can actually induce what's called hyperalgesia, which makes you more sensitive to pain. So then you feel even more dependent and you start taking even more opiates. So what I would say to that is not necessarily stigma, but just the more information, the more research that's coming out around opioids efficacy, it's really allowing treatment models to, like pain treatment models, to prevent addiction, right? So there's that. What do you think about people who are truly in pain using opioids for that use? Can they become addicted or can they not?
I can address that briefly. I think that for every substance of abuse, there needs to be two things that have to be understood. One is their primary purpose. For example, with opioids, right? That's for pain relief. That's the primary purpose. No one takes opioids just to become addicted, right? For, let's say, cocaine, right? It's for their stimulant properties. For nicotine, same thing, right? There's a primary value of a substance, and then there is the unintended consequence of addiction. And so what we're talking about here, and I really like Desiree's question, because it really allows you to differentiate both. Individuals who are taking opiates or opioids for pain, because they are in legitimate pain for all the negative reasons that Nicole has already kind of explained, despite the fact that they're taking it for pain, that drug is still entering the nervous system, still entering the brain, and is going to influence the reward circuitry, right? Whether you want it to or not. It's not like because you're in so much pain, that drug specifically goes to the site of pain modulation. Right. And so if you're taking that drug for legitimate pain, you are still inducing the neural adaptations and the rewiring of the brain that would lead to a more susceptible nervous system. And that's where the danger lies. So I think that it is empirically a myth. I think that the risk remains. I think that needs to be, I'm not, saying never use it. There might be reasons to use opioids. But I think that it should be a conscientious decision, knowing that there is a inherent risk involved.
I mean, there's pretty clear evidence. There's been some excellent documentaries that have been done, specifically Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, that they knew there was 1% would get addicted to their OxyContin. They knew that there was a percentage chance, even regardless of whatever the reason you're taking the drug, you could get addicted to opiates. And so, and just like before, we don't know within whom that's going to take place. It's very clear that other things that fueled the opioid addiction was the major overprescription of it, right? So giving drugs long after pain should have already subsided for people. And the pushing of opiates in cases where potentially you don't even need opiates, potentially. All that did was just put more drugs on the street, even if it was legal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And-
I either venture to say that myth that you're talking about, Desiree, came from education from the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. And some of their redesigns of some of their drugs actually, in some ways, have actually hastened it. So that they try to reformulate OxyContin such that people would stop abusing it, because it was supposed to, not allow for, chopping up the drug and maybe, going with a, nasal route of administration. And all they did was they took the drug into a form that now, if you simply heated it up, the coating would come off, and now you can make an injectable. And IV administration is just as good as trying to smoke something. And so that further elicited and would further allow you to become addicted to that substance, actually. So I would not say don't take it if you're in pain, but there's always a risk, and you just need to be careful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to pause for just a second and tell the rest of our participants who are still on with us, again, thank you so very much for joining this virtual conversation. Super important topic. We're really grateful that you could be here. Really grateful to Gerard and Casey that you could share your time and your expertise and your viewpoints with us. We have additional Learning Together content, including other webinars, podcasts, book clubs, some more information. You can always access that from the Lifelong Learning page on the alumni site. We're going to show that here. And then I do want to make sure that we have another webinar scheduled March 31 at 6:30 Central Standard Time. And that webinar is going to feature a conversation with the recipients of the 2021 Spirit of Trinity Award and the Distinguished Alumnus Award. So stay tuned. You're going to get more information on that coming your way. Go Tigers. Thank you so much for being here. I think if we can get back to the Q&A, if you guys are open for that, that would be awesome. Okay, we've got another question here from Dr. Wiley. Is a diabetic addicted to exogenous insulin?
Well, so no, right? Generally, people take insulin because they are trying to control their blood sugar. And they don't then start saying, I'm now going to take even more insulin because it just gives me even better control of my sugar. Right? There's always a target value you're trying to hit. And in addition, the negative consequences that would take place is from not taking your insulin, right? Because then now you're not treating your diabetes. And so I don't think that's really the same thing, right? In that case.
I really appreciate this question because, you know, some bright students have asked this question in class as well, and it's actually tougher to answer than you might think. Because if we're saying that certainly, you know, someone who's diabetic is not addicted to insulin because they need it to survive, then if someone took, I don't know, if someone abused opioids to the point where their withdrawal symptoms were literally going to kill that person that they needed to survive, are they no longer addicted to this substance, or are they no longer abusing the substance simply because I don't think the criteria of you need it to survive is necessarily excluding a substance from substance use disorder. I agree that it's not so I agree that a diabetic taking insulin is not addicted to insulin, but I have to admit that the reason surrounding my rationale hasn't been fully constructed in my head yet. Right.
Definitely can appreciate that. It makes me think of harm reduction strategies. You know, folks who are living with a substance use disorder, they're dependent, for instance, on heroin use. They can't just stop taking it, right? And if they're not ready, or for whatever reason they don't have access to treatment, what kind of harm reduction strategies can we have in our community to prevent them from dying, so it buys us time until they are ready to enter treatment? Right? So you see harm reduction strategies increasing, and there's more and more money and support around these strategies. And that's something like providing clean syringes, clean needles, going to a clean needle exchange, safe consumption sites, which have been happening in Canada for a while, and we're now starting to see pilot programs in the Pacific Northwest. Those are community-based strategies to help prevent somebody from dying if they were to go into withdrawal and they're using substances of addiction. So just something to kind of be thinking about. It's important that we're aware of these strategies and how we might be able to support them and champion them in our community, because ultimately they're contributing to health, right? The whole point is to get our communities and our members healthier. So speaking of that, there is another question in our Q&A box. And I'm not sure if this person is still with us, but I'm going to ask it. What do you do if social support, like hanging out with friends, is closely tied to and attached to substances like alcohol?
This is a really good, interesting problem, right? This is not an easy solution to this, because we know that context and environment can lead to recurrence. And so in many cases, you would want to probably wait, right? You certainly, you may want to sort of change the nature of that interaction, right? So if the nature was always you hung out with your friends in a bar, you may, at the beginning of your treatment, not do that to start, right? Still hang out with your friends, but not do it at a bar, do it at the park, right? So you can't even get access to some of these things. And so, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know if I could, would not take treatment advice from me, but I will tell you that certainly you would talk to, the people that are giving you treatment. But that, from the neuroscientist perspective, changing the environment and the nature of the interactions is what's going to be most likely key for this.
It's always a really good point that's brought up whenever we advocate for social interaction, right? Social interaction, social reward, it can protect you against, or help the recovery process, protect you against developing substance use disorder. And there's always this very valid point that's raised. While a lot of the social interactions that I have induce substance use, right? I go out to parties or bars, or even just, Thanksgiving dinners, or, family dinners can also sometimes involve drinking if it's with the right family members, right? And so I think that's the difference, though, between, again, casual substance use and pathological substance use disorder, right? If you are imbibing in alcohol if you're drinking in a group setting at a pleasant dinner at a restaurant, versus if you're drinking at home alone in social isolation. That is a difference between, I would say, substance use or casual use versus potentially going down the road of substance use disorder, potentially, right? I think that when we're talking about the advocating of social support for the protection and the recovery of substance use disorder, we're talking about the social support prior to the substance use, right? Like having your social support in place before you enter those contexts, before you enter, before you enter a situation that may put you in that road to develop those cravings. And outside when you're in the recovery process as well. So there is a line, I agree.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Casey, Gerard, it has been incredibly wonderful to talk to you tonight, learning so much and thinking about all kinds of points that you've raised and what that means and my understanding of addiction. Very, very helpful. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to our participants who joined us today, and we hope to see you again on the March 31 webinar that is going to be coming up. Stay tuned. You're going to get some more information there. If you have any lingering questions or comments, please feel free to share those now. We will be on for probably another minute or two, and then we will be hopping off for the evening. Thank you again. Any closing remarks, Casey and Gerard?
Appreciate you coming. Yeah, hopefully this was informative.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your time. I hope that you come away with this feeling optimistic that there are ways to tackle substance use disorder. There are a wealth of literature out there, and we can provide some for you too. If you want to contact any of us, there are ways and steps to take. All right, so it is something that is very, very much addressed, can be addressed, sorry.
I love that. That's really important. Substance use is treatable. People can enter long-term recovery. People can be well who have also been diagnosed with substance use disorder. Thank you. Thank you for that perception. Okay. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.